Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Babel, and as Assistant Chairman of the Speakers Program, I'd like to welcome you to another outstanding program in our spring series. Today we have with us Mr. Theodore Bikel. Mr. Bikel was born in Vienna, Austria in 1924, studied in London, and graduated from the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts in 1948. Mr. Bikel apprenticed with the Habima Theater in Tel Aviv and is the founder of the Tel Aviv Chamber Theater. Some of Mr. Bikel's theatrical appearances include A Streetcar Named Desire and The Love of Four Colonels, both produced in London. His New York appearances include Rope Dancers, The Lark, and The Sound of Music. Mr. Bikel's motion pictures include Blue Angel, Fraulein, Lady, The Russians Are Coming, and The Defiant Ones, for which he received an Academy Award nomination. Mr. Bikel has appeared on numerous television shows and has recorded many albums on the Elektra and Warner Brothers labels. His latest recording, A New Day, was just released by Warner Brothers. It is now my pleasure to introduce Mr. Theodore Bikel.
Thank you. And none of this qualifies me properly to speak about today's topic or to discuss any matters to do with politics, although the credentials are there too. I'll add them. I usually don't circulate those. I don't know why. I think they ought to be circulated. Having been in the line of fire both in the civil rights movement at the time when it was a black and white together movement, or rather when SNCC was a black and white together organization, and in Democratic Party politics, including that extraordinary cathartic experience of the Chicago Convention, to which I was a delegate, together with an intensely directed activity on campuses all over the country and in Canada and some countries in Europe as well. I'm prefacing my remarks with these scant credits in the social action and political field merely in order to indicate to you that I have never held to the view that a man, by virtue of his occupation, vocation, is disqualified from involving himself. When your side does it, it's involving yourself. When the other side characterizes it, it's called meddling in the affairs of politics, in the affairs of the country, the community. As a matter of fact, I think it downright dishonest of those who maintain that, for example, an actor or an entertainer, by virtue of his, or should I say by vice, of his occupational bent, he who seeks to please Democrats, Republicans, new lefters and new writers, old lefters and old writers, all alike, should not take any stands publicly or privately, certainly not publicly, in order to alienate the certain segments of the public who would then be turned off. Now, I think that this is a totally dishonest approach. I have a butcher at the corner of my street. Come election time, he hangs out a picture of his preferred candidate, and he takes a risk that 20, 50 people will stop buying meat from him, either for the duration of the election campaign or perhaps altogether, because obviously anybody who believes in a certain candidate poisons his meat. But he does take that risk. That's one of the glorious hazards of democracy. I don't think I can do any less. And the day is past when matinee idols with beautiful great temples walk in and out of stage doors to the adulation of all and sundry. So let's forget that aspect of it, and if anybody would, for example, attack Ronald Reagan on the grounds that he was an actor turned politician, I would oppose such an attack. You can attack him because he's a lousy politician and a lousy governor, not on the fact that he was an actor before he became a politician. There seems to be an unwritten law that only lawyers can with impunity proceed to politics without denigrating the mental makeup that they had before. Indeed, lawyers do proceed to politics and remain lawyers, which is sort of having your cake and eating it. An actor can't do that. At least, unfortunately, I haven't found that it was possible for Murphy, although I would have loved to have seen it, to go off during congressional recess and do some tap dancing. I think perhaps Reagan should do a Gunsmoke. That's about the kind of level that he deserves. I am no particular apologist for what is known as the establishment. I'm sorry that Bob gave the year of my birth, because that sort of casts a pall of suspicion over my qualifications otherwise. Youth is, of course, in the mind, and it's nothing to do with chronology. On the contrary, the establishment, as far as I see it, is criminally culpable in our society. I'm not saying this because I'm standing here at UCLA in front of an audience largely made up of students, but I'm saying it everywhere, and I'm yelling it loudest when confronting the older generation. They are criminally culpable because they seek to dress up the dilemma of our time as a political dilemma, when in reality it is a moral one. It is our morality that is called into question, not our political bent, not our view of the world, what the Germans used to call Weltanschauung, which is really not only the view of the world, but our analysis of the world, our looking back to where we have been, our assessing where we are, and our looking forward to any kind of organized and psychologically possible future. Now, politics has always been a sort of a combination, to my mind, of the philosophical and the pragmatic. But those who would have you believe that it is the institutions themselves which have failed their stated purpose are stopping short, to my mind, of an important consideration. The institutions have not failed themselves, they have failed the people who created them, the people that they are intended to serve. It is no coincidence that people on campuses do what they do because the meaninglessness of what is done elsewhere is so evident. And it is not a question of America's involvement in Vietnam alone, of America's insistence on pursuing illegal or immoral activities, which she does, nor is it a question alone of America being a monolithic capitalist country. She's capitalist, but she's far from monolithic. For it is quite clear that the youth rebellion occurs even in those countries and under such circumstances where capitalism is not the dominant rule or the rule of thumb, It occurs behind the Iron Curtain, albeit in a much subdued manner, because behind the Iron Curtain, the repressive measures are taken in a different fashion from those that are taken here, far more swift, far more brutal. What I'm trying to say is that if that line that divides, and it's been at various times described at age 30, I don't want to play any numbers games here, is really one that points to the identity crisis more than to anything else. Because if older people say, what the hell are these kids singing about, for example? I don't understand the music. Music happens to be a very important gauge as to the tenor of the times. What is this music all about? What does it want to say? That's very simple. The music of the 1920s was very easily definable. It was a non-attitudinal music. It was the Moon June variety, and it was Temptation and Stardust and all of that. Very nice little tunes that were totally meaningless as far as the lyrical content was concerned. When people ask me, what is the music of today about? It's about that telephone booth that each one of us finds himself in, with no one answering at the other end. It's that aloneness. I'm not talking about loneliness. Everybody, and throughout the ages, people have been lonely, and poets have been lonely. But the aloneness of man is what we're all about. It's no coincidence. No coincidence that the black demands, for example, for an insistence on black roots, black literature, black history, black letters, black music, black awareness, black identity, and hence black manhood. It is no coincidence that these demands singularly have pointed the way, among other people, other than the black community, to corollary insistence on other groups saying, all right, the blacks are yearning for their identity, they want it, they need it, they insist on it. Parallelly, I too must want, must yearn, must insist on my identity. I talk a great deal, as you may gather, to Jewish student groups. The great teachers bear names such as Stokely Carmichael, H. Rap Brown, James Foreman, people who are openly inimical, for example, to many other people in the society, certainly have made inimical noises to the Jewish community. And yet, the Jewish student community has learned from H. Rap Brown and from Stokely Carmichael to insist on their pluralistic right in this society, on saying Jewish is beautiful, Jewish roots, Jewish history, Jewish identity, and hence Jewish manhood. For it is the very essence of America that there is a proliferation of cultures. What this society is really about is to steamroll us all into a sameness. Now, I refuse to believe that the founding fathers did not know the English language. They wrote the same. They wrote equal when they could have written the same. Now, the two are not synonymous. Equal means equal access, equal opportunity. The same is a sort of the thing that we do face is that television, perhaps more than any other cause in this society, more than other factor in this society, makes us, whether we want it or no, into one image. Because the program that I see in New York City and that you see here in Los Angeles is also seen in Nevada, is also seen in Arizona, is seen in New Mexico. If you listen, those of you who are linguists or semanticists, you will find that even regional differences in speech pattern are beginning to disappear because our mentor, the television tube, seeks to make us all, whether it consciously wants to do it or not, it does make us all alike. Having gone through an Indian pueblo, for example, in New Mexico, which is very authentic and very beautiful, I went through and the tents and the teepees and whatever not, and suddenly at the end of it I said, there's something wrong here. And I looked back, and out of each tent stuck a television antenna. Now he too sees Andy Williams and Carol Burnett or whatever not. It's the same program that he sees. Now when I say that pluralism is an essential of American society, we're losing sight of that. And when the rebellion against the depersonalization that we all face articulates its premise on those terms, in those terms, then I think the accusation will be stronger, will be heeded in a different light. Spiro T. Agnew is a traitor to the American continuum, not only because he's wrong, not only because he's repressive, but because he doesn't know one damn word of Greek. Now, it is vitally important that people acknowledge roots, acknowledge background, acknowledge history. We do come with certain things in our knapsack. We carry those with us. And heirlooms, and I'm not only talking about a museum-like activity of taking a heritage and putting it on the mantelpiece and polishing it up. That's not what I'm talking about. Heritage is something vital and vibrant and alive, and something that we need constantly in order to develop ourselves. You build on heritage. You don't just look at it. It's not an archivist activity that I'm advocating. But this multicultural society, which fortunately we still are, will disappear into what some idiots call the mainstream of American mainstream. What the hell does that mean? Those who maintain that America is a melting pot are engaged in fostering an invidious and, to my mind, evil lie. America is not meant to be a melting pot. You think what happens in a melting pot? No definition, no color, a gray, nondescript mishmash of nothing definable. That's a melting pot. If America is meant to be anything at all, she is meant to be a kaleidoscope. Now you think of the difference, with each particle clearly defined and contributive to the beauty of the whole. Who the hell wants to walk into a meadow where all the flowers are the same? And yet that's what they seek to make us into. The same kind of flower. Now, those who might, and we're going to have questions and answers later, who would be quick to accuse me of advocating ethnocentricity or exclusivism, I want to disabuse you of that notion. Nothing could be further from my mind. I'm merely saying to acknowledge that man is different from his fellow man, culturally, ethnically, temperamentally. But that man's being different from his fellow man should never make him lesser. Surely is something that doesn't need stressing. That is true brotherhood. Not to say I don't see differences. To me, a man is a man, universal human being, the universal animal, is nonsense. You know all these nice, wishy-washy liberals who wander around Westchester or Westwood, indeed, who say, I don't see color. To me, I see a human being. I don't see color. Anybody who seriously says that is either a fool or a knave. He's a fool if he really doesn't see color, and he's a knave if he does and doesn't admit it. I, for example, see color, but I maintain that a black man is my brother. And I insist that he has the same rights and the same opportunities and the same access to the system that anybody else has, and to the services of the system that anybody else has. I see differences or differentness and make no value judgment. So if somebody says to me, you know, you keep telling me I'm an Italian, why should I sing Italian songs? Are they better songs than other people's? I never said that. Don't sing Italian songs because they're better songs, but because they're yours if you are of Italian origin. Yours. Sing them because they're your songs. And somebody's going to come into your living room or better into your kitchen, because that's where it's better done, and learn your song and be curious enough to learn what you're about and who you are and what you are. And if you're curious enough about his culture, you learn his. You learn his mores, his language. I admit, in fact, I welcome what is known, I guess, botanically as cross-pollination. That is fruitful. But in order to have cross-pollination, you must have clearly defined flowers or plants. Learn from each other. Admit the existence of your culture so that you may admit the existence of other people's. Because that general vague universalism is meaningless. It's meaningless in terms of America, and it's meaningless in terms of the world. You forge alliances with other people, with other families, with other groups, with other nations. Don't eradicate them, because it would be folly to do so. So let's create one globe, the one worlders. Do you think that if politically you were to remove the border, let us say, between Germany and Poland, the border would not be there by virtue of language, of mores, of culture, and often of religion? It's there. I don't say it has to be a political border. I'm not talking about customs officials or immigrations people. I'm talking about the fact that there must be an acknowledgement. Even in biblical times, the only example of when mankind was in danger of extinction was the Tower of Babel. Because there was an insistence, you see, of sameness there. And all of a sudden, people started talking different languages, and they were lost. Nobody could adjust to the notion that there should be different flowers. There was psychological danger right there. It was a beautiful parable to what we face now. Having insisted for a couple of decades now in the nice liberal left-wing or mildly left-wing parlance that all men are equal, we have misread that to mean that all men are the same. And we're beginning to reap the fruit, the bitter fruit of that destructive notion. That, I happen to think, is also part of what youth is rebelling against. Whether they articulate it so or not, and I don't believe that it is being articulated in those terms. It's only articulated when it becomes a political issue. When everybody, for example, on campus, quite rightly, alongside with a black campus community, insists on the black continuum. but they have not seen the parallel as yet in those strong terms in which I would like them to, which I hope that we will arrive at a consensus that is what must happen eventually, lest we perish, because we are in danger, in grave danger of perishing. Now, there's a suicidal streak, before I go on to that, suicidal streak, especially in the political sense, in the New Left. There's such an insistence on the part of the New Left that unless somebody totally and completely agrees to the last dotted I and the crossed T. A couple of days ago I heard a speech in which a man spoke of crossed I's and dotted T's, which seemed to be sort of a remarkable slip of the tongue. To insist that everybody agree with you on every tactic, on every facet, both theoretically and practically, of what you're engaged in doing, then you don't want anything to do with them. It has almost been the death knell, for example, of something which is called the New Democratic Coalition, that came out in the wake of the Chicago Convention, where those who had lost there, and we did lose rather heavily, lost on the peace position and lost on the candidates. But some candidates, some of those who inherited the mantle of discontent had different heroes to look toward and different standard bearers. There were the Kennedyites and the McGovernites, and certainly those who followed Senator Eugene McCarthy. Now, after it was all over, one thought, but the shouting really started. Because one could not agree on the meaning of the word coalition. The very word coalition assumes various factions who wish to coalesce. Because if it were all that pure and unadulterated, the word coalition would make no sense at all. But people started quarreling among themselves. Sorensen has no right to sit in these councils. Schlesinger has no right to participate, because they're tainted with a brush of several years of a Kennedy administration, which after all was a culprit as well in bringing about the dilemma, the political and military dilemma that we find ourselves in now. Therefore, everybody was being shut out of the councils of the New Democratic Coalition. But what happens to Democrats also happens to the New Lefters. It's no secret to anyone, especially on the campus, that the SDS, whether you like it or dislike it, but it's a political fact, the SDS killed itself by factionalism. It's dead. It's dead as a movement. It is fractionalized and factionalized beyond recognition from what it was 2.5 years ago. And therefore powerless, because it refuses to acknowledge common goals and thereby make coalition. Now, to the mind of some, this is a salutary development. I have personally no great love for some of the platforms and planks that the SDS adopts, or factions of the SDS. One must be very careful to state that, because otherwise you get a different leader of the SDS getting up. So what are you yelling at me for? That's him. No great love. But the fact remains that if you want to achieve anything in the political process, you must be prepared to bargain. To bargain with your allies, let alone your enemies. Bargaining with your allies, bargaining in general, presupposes a give and take. Not a sellout, because, these absolutist terms are really You know, that's also, in a sense, a cop-out. It's very easy to walk out of a room. Not a sellout or a cop-out. What? It presupposes that you acknowledge the existence of ad hoc alliances. That, for example, rebellious people on campus would acknowledge that there are pockets of the older establishment. I hate to use that word, but for want of a better one, there are pockets extant with which alliances can work. It is possible to march on the Pentagon together. It is possible to talk of peace and the erosion of our ecological balance. Take Santa Barbara as an example. Happens to be a community of Democratic, Republican stripe. There are SDSs there are New Leftists there are YAFers there. They're all united on the subject that there should be no offshore drilling. Now, that's the broadest kind of alliance. I don't pretend that such exigencies should, or are salutary, that they should exist elsewhere. But that's the broadest kind of alliance. But it so happens that it's quite possible for a member of the Weathermen faction in Santa Barbara to link arms with a member of the Young Americans for Freedom, with whom he wouldn't even exchange the time of day at another time, when it comes to that topic of offshore drilling and killing birds and killing the environment. Alliances, make them. I once sat in a cab in New York. He took me over to Brooklyn, and they said, yeah, there ain't going to be no peace. He said, no peace. Can't be no peace. You know, people are not made that way. He says, you know when there's going to be peace? He says, when we're going to be invaded from outer space, he says, and it's going to be a case of the cockroach people against the human people. That's when we're going to have peace. Now, in his simplistic cab driver wisdom, he had something there, because that offshore drilling happens to be the cockroach people all of a sudden, which unites us all. When the wolves howl outside, sheep draw together. Well-known fact to anybody who's ever worked with sheep, and I have at one time or another. Not with great gusto and glee, but I have. Because they smell a lot. But that, I submit, is an attitude fitting to sheep, not to men, not to human beings. We ought to be able to draw together on positivist impulses rather than only on the negative one. Again, if I may cite the example of the Jewish community. The Jewish community, for example, is at its strongest as a community when anti-Semites roam the streets yelling for Jewish blood. It's very easy to be a Jew then. Very easy. But when there's a relative absence of such threats, then one lets it lapse. And then muscles that are not exercised, you know what happens to those. One forgets to use them, and soon enough, after a few generations, they perhaps atrophy altogether. Now, I refuse to believe that the cultural muscle of the American people should allow itself to be atrophied by those processes such as the television and its influence on us. We shouldn't let television abuse us that way. We should use it rather than have it use us. And we should use it. Frankly, in Marshall McLuhan's terms, since we are a linear people, and then that our entire thrust is toward the page, the written page, the printed page, and that all the institutions still operate that way, with an orientation toward the linear rather than the tactile. I don't know whether tactile is such a good term, because it presupposes a three-dimensional thing, which is not what the audiovisual elements are all together. But I'll accept Marshall McLuhan's term of tactile versus the linear. And I'm comforted by the fact that in order to explain his theory of tactility, Marshall McLuhan had to write a book. But be that as it may, it is no secret. I read some figures the other day that were staggering. Any kid has 2,000 hours of television viewing before he hits kindergarten. Now, I defy anybody to tell me that that does not forever, in that kid's life, shape his channels of receptivity, his channels of communications. That's how that kid operates. And therefore, it is absolutely no surprise to anyone that when demonstrations happen in the street, that the slogan is the whole world is watching you. Because news, for example, is no longer what happens on the front page of the Los Angeles Times or the New York Times or the Washington Post. News, it is what is on Huntley Brinkley and on Walter Cronkite, and only there. That's news. Now, if you acknowledge that, then some priorities have to be reordered too, with the educational process, with the learning process, with the information process. The singly most important thing that has happened in the last 3 years, for example, educationally speaking, is a program on television called Sesame Street. Because it uses television. All the entire sensory attitudes of kids in the nursery that are attuned to that kind of process are now being appealed to, not by Captain Kangaroo or Romper Room or some such moronic idiocy, but by a program that uses everything and uses it with humor, even has commercials that are anti-commercials and non-commercials. The next 15 minutes comes to you courtesy of the letter W. You know, a commercial. And everything that happens for 15 minutes is W, until a little animal comes and eats one of the strokes of the W, and they say, okay, N. You know, fine. It's used, and it's used well. And kids who watch that, and there have been surveys, all right, count better, count faster, do their arithmetic, read faster, and read better, because of the repetition of the ABC and of the numbers from 1 to 10. It's vitally important. If that works with the kindergarten, it'll work in the high school, and it'll work in the university. If we begin to have an audiovisual approach to all things, that at all times we remind ourselves that we do live in the 70s, and that we have to make contact, and perhaps in that sense the word tactile is very aptly chosen. That communication presupposes contact. And I come back to the original premise of what I talked about, and that is the telephone booth theory, that we are all sitting in the telephone booth by ourselves, dialing all kinds of numbers, hoping for answers, rather than touching a living, breathing human experience. That too. Now, of course, this has dangers. We're not a nation of doers, or until 5 years ago we weren't, but a nation of watchers. We let other things and pre-chewed pre-packaged entertainment and enlightenment and educational facilities do our walking for us. Also an insidious notion, let your fingers do the walking for you, everything is yellow pages. Now, education is not only thinking, but it is also doing, in the main. Now, refuse to believe, especially in the light of the population explosion, and again I have to remind you that since the beginning of civilized man, I'm not offended that people walk out, I know that there are classes at 1 o'clock. Since the beginning of civilized man, whatever that may mean, but let's say after the Cro-Magnon man, since the beginning of recorded history, of all the people who were ever alive, 1/3 is alive today. That's a frightening thing to contemplate. But it also is an awesome responsibility. It's something that we have to address ourselves to. And not with this institutionalized crap of self-perpetuation that we're always insistent upon, of membership drives, of wall-to-wall carpets, of trappings, of form instead of content. I'm sick and tired of form. Form is important only in one way. The human mind needs symbolisms, needs symbols. You need customs and rites. One needs certain outward trappings of inner content. But those trappings, once they get to replace content and become the only thing extant, that to me is an evil notion. And we're in danger of doing that. The revolution on the campus and in the streets is in danger of doing that, of thinking it is more important to write slogans on walls than to do something constructive and instructive, self-instructive and vis-a-vis other people. It is not more important to write slogans or to go to jail for having written slogans, but to achieve something, to grab power, real power. And that means not walking away, not saying everything has to be burned down before something meaningful, anything meaningful can be built. If a house is infested with vermin, clean it before you burn it down. Maybe you'll have a perfectly good house to inhabit. But cleaning is a longer and more wearisome process than burning. And one must look that way too, because there are children to be helped and there are children to be hurt. Either way. And that too has to be watched. I don't think we react to the anguish of the individual anymore, because we get jaded by numbers. Just as I resented and rejected reporters who came into my living room for press conferences regarding the civil rights movement in the South, and unless we had some murders or rapes to give them, they weren't interested. We too become jaded. It is the overkill and the mass murder that appeals to our sensibilities, and I doubt sometimes that does. I point to Biafra as an example. I doubt whether we even react to those stimuli properly anymore. But the anguish of the individual suffering is something that we are losing because there are so many of us. And we thought that only the Chinese were impervious to such notions. You know, kill 1 million Chinese, there's still a hell of a lot left. Not my words, Lim Piao's. It's not good enough. There is a sanctity in human life, and there's a devastation in human suffering, and I think we have to bear it in mind. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. Instead of using the mics, I think if you just move a little closer, we'll be able to hear you.
And I'll repeat what... Yes? The question was, what was my opinion about integration and interreligious marriages, right? Interracial and interreligious marriages. I've known both kinds. They work or they don't work. Obviously, there are more obstacles in their way than there are obstacles in the way of any marriage. And any marriage has a lot of obstacles to overcome. I don't believe that, that it is an evil to marry, as it were, out of your race or out of your faith. I don't believe that this constitutes a solution to the problem of the races. Some people would have you believe that if we only intermarried enough, then all problems would disappear. I don't believe this to be so, and frankly, and there, again, I'm posing a cultural, I'm in a cultural dilemma here, and I'm posing to you the problem that arises of transmission of culture to the children. If I had found empirically that interracial and interreligious marriages, perhaps the latter more than the former, would transmit the best of both cultures to their children, so that the child is doubly enriched, I would be the first one to advocate it as almost a panacea to a lot of ills. Unfortunately, I have found that out of 10 such marriages, perhaps 9 have resulted in the children getting neither culture, in an effort to sort of not offend or offset each other. And therefore, what we are breeding very often, unless you get extraordinary parents, and with extraordinary parents there's never any problem. And I know those too, they exist and they're marvelous. But in the run-of-the-mill interreligious marriage, for example, causes a neutralization of both cultures, and therefore a child grows up as what I must term a functional amnesiac. No memory of the world of his father or of his mother. And that is a dangerous point, and again, a point of erosion. It's dangerous to do that. Now, I'm saying that an interreligious marriage is not in itself a problem. It is a symptom, for example, of a problem. If somebody didn't care enough, for example, to look to his own people, to his own group, didn't care to find out communality of interests, then of course he never met anybody from his own group to marry or to fall in love with. And I'm not gainsaying that you can, and very often somebody who did care enough also went outside of the group to find somebody, simply because that's the human experience. You do. But it's ridiculous of those, and there are many priests especially, and some rabbis, many rabbis, who consider inter-religious marriage to be an absolute and unmitigated evil. I don't hold that view. It is not a disease. It may be a pimple, but you don't cure. Yes? I hope you all heard the question. If you haven't, that the negativity, for example, of the Jewish scene in this country has caused a lot of that phenomenon which I spoke of before, and that since the Jewish parents of today are incapable of leading a positive Jewish life, there doesn't seem to be any point to getting back to that kind of a life, yet that there are many young Jews who seek to perpetuate their heritage, getting back to a purer view of what it was, not necessarily, says the questioner, in the religious sense, but in the cultural, the ethnic sense. I fully agree that with your analysis of the problem. In very simple terms, it very often was again a question of appearances and of images, because a lot of kids today, more than the greater majority of the kids today, are third generation, or rather, you call that second generation American born. Their grandparents came over. The big Jewish immigration happened near the beginning of the century. Came over and they looked funny and they talked funny. And their children try to get away from that as fast and as furiously as possible. And became more American than apple pie. Now their children, today's youths, suddenly feel that lack. Because their parents, in their haste to get away from those funny-looking, funny-sounding birds who were the grandparents of these, have lost a lot of things in the process. They've lost linguistically 2 languages, Yiddish and Hebrew, but certainly Yiddish. And they've lost a great deal of culture. And it all becomes now, it's a sort of a nostalgic view where a lot of youths long for their grandparents' world and long for the world of the shtetl, and not as seen merely through the eyes of Broadway, which is not kosher theater but kosher style theater at best. There are no fiddlers, and there were never any sitting around on roofs in the shtetl. But there was, alongside with the suffering and the squalor and the deprivation, there was also a beauty. And that's a question of beauty, of Jewish is beautiful. To get back to that and to forget that there are membership drives and again wall-to-wall carpets, and again all of that demographic Jewishness is as ridiculous as culinary Jewishness. You know, I live among Jews, I mix with Jews, hence I'm a Jew. Or which is as bad as saying I eat gefilte fish, hence I'm a Jew. Because television tells us that you don't have to be Jewish to eat Levi's rye bread, and you don't have to be Jewish to drink Manischewitz wine on all kinds of occasions. And by inference, of course, you don't have to be Jewish to like Jewish humor, or indeed to dispense it, see Danny Thomas. And you do not have to be Jewish to adore Fiddler on the Roof. Now the question inexorably poses itself, if that is so, what do you have to be Jewish to do? Since America seems to become more Jew conscious, the Jews have become less so. Now, this is a trap. Lots of young Jews fall into that. And not all young Jews are rebels or radicals. And many of them are apathetic. And a lot of them are acceptors of the status quo. I know a lot of Jews young Jews, in their teens and in their early 20s, who are miniature old Jews. They've gone straight from childhood to old age without once hitting the turbulence of adolescence. Now, I talked, for example, at the University of Texas with the president of the Jewish fraternity. I was interested, and I said to him, "What do you do here that's Jewish?" I was interested, and he said, "We're all Jews." I said, "I know that. I didn't ask that." I said, I know you're all Jews because that's the charter of the fraternity house. But what do you do that's Jewish?" He said, "Well, you know," he said, "handball, basketball." And I got the idea. He thinks handball playing and basketball playing is Jewish because all the participants are Jews. But that's no more than the mistake his father makes. His father thinks that golf playing is Jewish because it belongs to a Jewish golf club. The fact he had to build that one because the others wouldn't let him in is something apart again. But he's convinced that golf playing is a Jewish activity. More than that, a religious one, as evidenced by the fact that it's done on Saturday mornings. And his mother thinks that bridge playing is Jewish because when all the ladies around the table, including the dummy, are Jews. So why shouldn't he make that mistake? Why shouldn't he assume that that's all there is to it, without regarding the ethical and moral content of what it is to be a Jew, and that you cannot, even religiously, as far as the Jewish tradition is concerned, reach for God unless you reach for man, first and foremost, and that most of what you would think are religious works, the Talmud, the Mishnah, are not really religious works, but secular works, religiously inspired, that say how to disport yourself vis-a-vis your neighbor, how to treat him and how not to maltreat him. They deal with birth, with marriage, with hygiene, with a myriad of things that blueprints for everyday living, of course in the light of an ethos, but less with formalistic religious things than anything else. But of course parents don't know that, they don't live that. They know membership drives, and they know UJA appeals, and they know I pledge this and I pledge that, and that's what the kid sees. Why shouldn't he walk away from that? That's meaningless in terms of, in activist terms and anything else. But I also know that some are beginning to realize that it's not an empty phrase, that, for example, to work for the rights of your dispossessed and disenfranchised brothers of the other sections of the community is a direct outflow of Jewish commandment. Ve'ahavta le're'acha kamocha, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. No qualifying adjectives, not Jewish neighbor, not white neighbor, neighbor. And unless it means anything, then it must be interpreted that way. And people are beginning to realize that, and young Jews coming to their own parents and accusing them, not that they are Jews, but that they are less than Jews, because they've become establishment and very waspish in the application thereof as well. And they're doing it in the purest prophetic sense. They say what the prophet said to the establishment then, all of which was Jewish. The prophet said, Zantem, you have whored. That's very biblical for your cop-outs. You have whored. And what was the reaction of the establishment? Labor, into the dungeon with him, because you don't like to hear that, even from the prophets, especially from the prophets. No secret that the repressiveness of that is indicated very clearly by the speeches of Spiro Agnew is something that is an absolutely real and tangible menace, right here and now, because we've come to a point where it is very dangerous for a person to speak his views. It is followed almost immediately by reprisals. I know it personally. I can tell you, I mean, obviously being in an extremely visible medium and kind of job, it happens to many persons that I know. It happens to me to some extent as well. There is an immediate notion that unpopular views must not only be stifled but also punished by the loss of livelihood, by the loss of access to the amenities of society. An immediate rap on the knuckles follows. And, you know, anybody who has seen the top broadcasters in the country white with rage around their mouths at the audacity of the attempt to stifle them, to stifle analysis, not opposition, but analysis. And that a presidential speech, for example, immediately after those outbursts of Agnew was followed by an immediate non-analysis of what the president had said. A précis followed of what he had said. A descriptive material, like tomorrow's quick summation of what the president's speech was all about, without once expressing what it is that he said and what it meant. What he meant, or what the analyst thought he meant thereby. Now, they did that at first blush, but they've come back fighting with their gloves on, or off, whichever way you may. But the fact remains that that the syndrome of live ammunition in rifles of the National Guard, that symbolism is carried to all segments of our power structure. There is live ammunition in their rifles, and make no mistake about it. Names are being taken. That used to be a despicable tactic during Joe McCarthy's time, a despicable tactic certainly of all the totalitarian countries. The only in totalitarian countries are names taken. And anybody who gives you that crap about having to guard against internal and external enemies, that is also the semantic ploy that was used then and that is being used now. A free democratic society must take its chances with freedom, and it doesn't now, and it doesn't intend to. they don't even know what freedom is anymore, and I don't think we do. A lot of kids in college today have never lived one day of their lives without those threats hanging over their heads. And it's, frankly, even those who fight against the lack of freedom are beginning to engage in those self-same tactics, because that's what they see the other side is doing. You think I don't find it despicable that in some meetings, some sections of the New Left or of the radical left, that some sections of the SDS and Panthers disrupt speakers before they even said the first word? Now that too is stifling to me. I'm willing to listen to a Nazi and then answer. I'm not willing to disrupt him before he even opens his mouth. But why should they know any better? That's all they've ever known. Yell him down. Don't let him talk. Yes? Yeah, we have time for one more question. It's a dilemma. I'll take this gentleman. I have read I've read parts of Jerry Rubin's book. In my hectic life, you don't always read all the books that you read, but you read in them in order to know. Yes, I have. Do I have a copy? No, I borrowed one. All right. I'm getting a present. Thank you. Thank you. I may say parenthetically that I have had my quarrels, certainly ideological quarrels, with Jerry Rubin, with Abby Hoffman. I think they too, in many instances, belong to the amnesiac generation, because they very often do not acknowledge background and roots, and some do revolution because it's proper to do revolution, and I do believe that it is. And other times they do revolution, as it said, and I'm quoting, for the hell of it, as an exercise in revolt. The proper notion of hell, I think, is perhaps a small room where two people, Abby Hoffman and Julius Hoffman, are shut up together for all eternity.
Thank you very much.